The metacrisis is the historically specific threat to truth, beauty, and goodness caused by our persistent misunderstanding, misvaluing, and misappropriating of reality. It arises from the material and spiritual exhaustion of modernity. It is a multifaceted delusion. It is the crisis within, between, and beyond our existing conception of crisis. And it manifests institutionally and culturally to the detriment of life on Earth. The meta-crisis is something about our relationship to all of the crises in the world. So it's reflexive, it's inherently reflexive. It's about talking through, thinking through, how does human nature relate to this thing? Now, that's quite distinct from polycrisis or permacrisis or all these other terms. What's different about metacrisis is it acknowledges human interiority and relationality as a fundamental part of the problem, or the problematic, I should say. The other way of looking at metacrisis, and there are many actually, but you can see it as a sign that modernity is ending. And so this expression of Zach Stein's time between worlds, that we're in a time between worlds, captures that. And it's because we're in a time between worlds that things don't make sense. Things begin to break down. And this is where, again, you can get into John Gebser's notion of the mental rational function breaking down, which in plain language is intellectually we're not up to it anymore. The intellectual function is not succeeding in making sense of the world. The world is eclipsing or going beyond our capacity to make sense of it. And these are all signs that our existing form of consciousness is somehow in need of evolution, in need of growing in some way. But I also think meta's kind of alive. Like, I think there's a kind of participatory knowing of the meta-crisis. When you put it as a proposition and say, define the meta-crisis, it becomes one more concept among a million concepts. The meta-crisis is your daily experience of a world falling apart. It's your incredulity towards how weird everything's becoming. Both the kind of rapid technological growth and the combination of synthetic biology and AI and virtual reality changing the life world. And then you have things like gene editing and so on that are actually changing life as such. And then you have maybe a new phase of geological time. The academics are still arguing about it, but for all intents and purposes, the Holocene has ended. The stable geological period that has lasted many thousands of years is now unstable, and we're entering uncharted territory. And you can see that in the planetary boundary framework very clearly, but you can also feel it. The quick definition would be something like, the meta-crisis is all the crises put together, right? And people go, oh, I see. But they don't see, right? Because it's not really the end of it. That's just the beginning of the conversation. The meta-crisis is also in the way you make sense of the world, the way you feel it and emote in relation to it. The meta-crisis is in your incapacity to fully articulate and narrate the self in this context. And the meta-crisis is also coextensive with, co-arising with this particular historical epoch. So it's not as though there haven't been meta-crises before. I mean, arguably the time of Christ was a kind of meta-crisis. If you think about an occupying Roman Empire, a kind of religious fervor, people waiting for the Messiah, and then this person appears apparently doing miracles. Everyone's totally confused, right? Just as we are kind of now. So one of many examples where it's not like we haven't had historical turbulence before. Is there something distinct about today? Yes. That we're actually destroying our only home. Our one precious planet in the infinite reaches of space is under threat. Not of annihilation necessarily, but of being a habitat for human life. That's in question now. Forms of technology developing so rapidly that you can get into a world of autonomous weapons that really can cause massive destruction. So what's different today is the degree of risk to the planet as a whole. That's one distinct feature of the meta-crisis. But arguably we had this with nuclear weapons as well. So it's different, but at the same time, I like to speak of the meta-crisis in a way that doesn't just leave you dazed and confused and looking as a passive subject at at a kind of unfamiliar object saying, that's the metacrisis. What do I do? That's not the way to go. The metacrisis is our historical inheritance. We're born into this. It's this generation that perceives it and feels it. It's the set of cards we have to play. It's not something we can fix. The problem with the crisis framing is that it's still a kind of tacit problem-solution mentality. That would be misunderstanding the nature of the metacrisis. What's going on is a very slow historical process that's culminating in a certain way and beginning to transform into something else. The nature of what it transforms into will depend whether we survive and thrive or collapse. I believe about 90% of what I just said. But there's another part of me that says, are we sure this is the time between worlds? Is modernity really ending? You know, if I told, I don't know, Elon Musk or Sam Altman that modernity is ending, they just laugh at me, right? So I'm thinking of the other side saying, modernity is not ending. What are you talking about? It's just taking off. If anything, technology is going to radically change the world and solve a lot of these problems. Now, I don't feel that. It's not how I'm politically, socially, culturally, intellectually oriented. But it's possible. It's possible that you solve something like nuclear fusion and have abundant energy. It's conceivable that a lot of the illnesses that lead us to suffer and die will be dealt with. It's conceivable that the powers that be that somehow at the moment seem so cut off from the rest of the world will be in some sense democratized and brought back into the fold, such that the great benefits that are currently accruing in a very small number of people are shared more widely, and people might insist on that. So I'm not sort of predisposed to feel that collapse is sort of absolutely necessary. On the other hand, I do feel a kind of collapse is underway. And the challenge for us is, collapse is underway. What does a transformative response to collapse look like? But look, I say this in a kitchen in a suburb of London, living quite a full, healthy life in a safe, democratic, more or less, country. So there's a lot of incredulity here. There's a lot of dissonance, confusion, that we live as if living a normal life while watching the news in our pocket, the kind of planet in our pocket that says everything's falling apart. And yet we go to the shop and we buy our milk and we walk back home as if things are normal. So that's kind of the metacrisis too. It's the experience of confusion that's now baked into our lives as we hear about our world collapsing on the news and on our phones, but often live as if life could carry on forever. I was formed, as many, many millions of people were, with a notion of what normal looks like. And a lot of what's going on is a kind of clambering to get normal back. Like, solve these problems, you know, like make democracy stronger, make the market work, but just get rid of the environmental externalities. You know, yes, there's problems with, you know, mass immigration, but surely we can just build more houses and, you know, there's a kind of notion that make, do and mend is enough, right? But many don't feel that in their hearts, right? Many feel this is something altogether different. Now, I think what's going on in our kind of community, in our world, is that most people are reading the position and seeing that the make, do and mend story doesn't sound like it's true. It seems very unlikely. It seems more likely that there'll either be in the next years, decades, hard to say exactly how quickly, but forms of dissolution and collapse in various parts of the world. You know, you're already seeing people dying of heat deaths and people losing their homes to floods and forest fires, and we haven't really seen AI biting properly yet on the labour market, but that will begin to happen. And we see deep fakes affecting democratic elections, and that will happen more. Like the Nobel Prize winner Maria Ressa feels that 2024 will be the last year of proper democratic elections, because she sees the problem of these technologies. Basically, you can't trust public opinion. The notion of universal suffrage is compromised by the fact that the information stream is polluted with falsehoods. And so the legitimacy that underpins democracy is in question, right? And so you get problems with authoritarianism and so on. If that seems confusing, it's because it is. It's because all these things are happening at once. Most people in our sector of the internet, in our sort of world, feel intuitively that something deeper is going on. And we look to history sometimes to see, what is this like? What kind of transition is this like? And there are many ways of doing it, but one would be the axial age. One would be to say there was a moment in time about, give or take, 500 years before Christ, where there was the early signs of systematic thought. That we sort of moved out of a kind of mythos into a kind of logos, where we began to actually have sort of reason and writing, and we would turn from a barter economy to money, and there was a move towards the cities away from the country, and in our consciousness the sort of notion of the individual was kind of born. And then at this time Buddha appeared, and Lao Tzu and so on, and many of the Greek philosophers. And around that time it was as if the whole world, although it wasn't evenly spread, developed a new kind of consciousness. And I think a lot of people in my world feel something else like that is happening. And it's a very audacious, somewhat absurd thing to think. But it roughly is what I think. It feels more true than that we can muddle through with the existing framework. So when people ask me what I'm doing sometimes, because I did a lot of work on climate change, I have a lot of contacts in that world. And they're working on, getting the government to sign up to net zero by 2030 or whatever the latest thing is. And I'm like, well, you can do that if you like, but I think something altogether deeper is happening, and that you're not likely to succeed that way. I place more hope in a fundamental transformation of consciousness than I do in dealing with things with the institutional and cultural structure we have now. It's worth saying a bit more about Time Between Worlds, because it's, like I say, the expression was first mooted in a book title by Zachary Stein called Education in a Time Between Worlds. And the term is very charming, and so people use it as a shorthand for this period of time. But it's important to understand that it has precursors. So in sociology, particularly Gramsci, there's this notion of the interregnum, where one thing has ended but the next thing hasn't yet been born. In anthropology, there's the notion of the liminal, which is really fascinating for our community, because what it is to be in the liminal is for an ethnographer who is from one culture, let's say a regular Western culture, goes into a tribal context or an indigenous context, and he's trying to do deep ethnographic work. So he's trying to sort of live like them, with them, and observe them, participant or observation. But there's a period of time when they're so ensconced in that world that they almost forget what it was like to be in the prior world, but they're not yet one of them. And that's what they mean by liminal in anthropology. And in some ways that's how a lot of our community is. It's like we don't entirely belong to the world as it is now, although we're still part of it. And yet there isn't really another thing that we're fully belonging in, so we're in this in-between phase. The other thing to say about Time Between Worlds is it's not just a poetic soundbite. There's quite a lot of empirical work underpinning it. So Immanuel Wallerstein's World System Dynamics is one of these sources. And that's to do with understanding the world system as trade flows, and it's actually a very political analysis. It's to do with the exploitation of the poor world by the rich world, and following the pattern of that over time and seeing that it lacks durability, that it will inevitably collapse. And then you have work by people like Peter Turchin to do with secular cycle theory. It's some similar theory of history. He sometimes calls it cliodynamics, which is the sort of quantitative history of looking at past patterns and seeing how they repeat today, and measuring things like income inequality and autocratic governance and so on, and beginning to sort of do a quantitative measure when this number of things happen, things fall apart. So the Time Between Worlds is not just a feeling, there's also a kind of empirical underpinning to it. And at its heart, there's an analysis of modernity, right? And what the hell is that, right? Now, I'm not sure I can adequately describe modernity, but Habermas speaks of it as an orientation towards the future. And a big part of what's happening in our world is people are not so sure about the future. It's not clear where this ship is sailing, where we're going, right? So to be in a time between worlds in that sense, and the reason some people call it meta-modern, is that if the orientation to the future and the progress narrative is in a big part of what modernity is about, first of all, we can't see the future very clearly, and if anything, we're a bit wary of it. And secondly, it's not at all clear it's progress. It might well be regress. And that's why it's between worlds. And then you also have, though, rather than just woe is me, everything's falling apart, there are these well springs of renewal. You know, there are these people doing different things. Like, I'm thinking here of maybe Joe Brewer, who's currently trying to get a river back to life in Barichara, Colombia. And that's exciting because he's kind of given up on the nation state. He's like, we need to start building the bioregional hubs. And then there are many bioregions around the world. If more people start to work around bioregions, you might find a new form of governance emerging. Then you have this notion of like cosmolocalism, which is something to do with being wise about your production patterns, so that if something is very heavy to transport, you don't transport it, you use it locally. But also it's more philosophically, it's kind of like you focus locally on your niche and your immediate needs in your community, but you're connected to this much bigger cosmological framework because of the internet. And you have other ideas, you know, there's ontological mutiny, it's a term of bioeconomafism, that we somehow have to just break out of this kind of collective illusion that we're part of. My colleague Ivo Mensch also speaks about this. He jokes that we're collectively living a life that no longer exists. And a lot of us feel that way. When then Bonita has work on complex potential states, something to do with intuiting potential. It's quite a Taoist, go with the energy kind of notion. So it's not as though there's no ideas. It's not as though no one has any idea what happens next. But if you look at it at scale, in terms of where the power is, who has power now, particularly technological power, it is daunting. And it takes quite a lot of courage and resilience not to just give in to despair. I came across it through my friend Zachary Stein, and I think he worked on it with Mark Gaffney, and it's to do with what they call the stations of the self. And it's not really a developmental theory, but it's more a way of describing a sort of existential interiority of the human being as it goes through life. And the stages are roughly pre-tragic, tragic, and post-tragic. Pre-tragic is something like, we can fix every problem, everything's going to be okay, don't fixate on your worries, everything will work out in the end, we can do it kind of mentality. So arguably a lot of techno-optimism is pre-tragic. It's sort of like not really contending with just how compromised everything already is. The tragic, though, is to be lost and broken by despair. The tragic is to be unable to function because you're so thoroughly depressed when everything seems to be going wrong. But the problem with tragic is you get stuck in them, completely stuck in them. And the claim here is that it's not that it's better to be post-tragic as such, but just there is also a state of sort of sensibility available to us that doesn't have the pre-tragic, nothing's wrong, everything will be fine, but nor is it lost forever in the kind of the implosion of the tragic. It reclaims the agency of the pre-tragic, informed by the understanding of the tragic, to live in a way that recognizes that suffering and pain is an endemic feature of life. Humans screw things up all the time. We can't help it almost. I believe one of the better definitions of sin, for what it's worth, is from Francis Spufford. He calls it the human propensity to fuck things up. And it's a real feature of human life. So the post-tragic recognizes that as something that we can't escape. There will be no Eden as such. There will still be wars, there will still be sociopaths, there will still be narcissists, there will still be corruption. And yet you don't collapse in despair because of that, because it's not really your work to do to solve that. That's baked into reality as the oppositional principles that gives rise to creative possibilities and so on. What the post-tragic's about is rediscovering the beauty on the other side of the suffering, to see that somehow the soul is formed through those contests, those battles. at scale things are so bad we have to rethink. That's where it comes into structures of consciousness and mind, because reason is powerful and good. Science, when it's working well, is important. And we shouldn't wish these things away. But what is true, and I think Paul Marshall does a particularly good job at this in his book, Complex Integral Realism. He speaks about the biases of the modern mind. And what he's doing there is fleshing out Jean Gebser's notion of the evolution of consciousness and the mind in its mental rational function breaking down. And he's spelling it out. And he speaks about the sort of various kinds of biases, but the essence of it, the way he sums it up, is that the modern mind got very good at standing back. And like the term polycrisis, it's all standing back and looking at it. But it lost its way in terms of looking within, which is more about the depth of the psyche, the deep interior. And it lost its way in terms of, let's say, cosmovision and metaphysics. It stopped asking, what are our assumptions about the fabric of reality, right? And those two moves, the looking within and looking beyond, are the other two meanings of meta, which is why I think metacrisis is the term to use, because that's the work we have to do. It's like, what is inside the imaginal realm? What is the psyche? How do we know it better? How do we live through it so that we have less need of consumer durables to live well? That we don't need to meet our emotional needs by buying something new, necessarily. And at the same time, the sort of broadly liberal imaginary that says, have your religion if you want, but keep it out of the public realm as far as you can, doesn't seem to be working very well. It would appear that we need a view of the world that is altogether more enchanted, more profoundly, I think, personal. It's not like anything goes. It's not like you surrender your intellect or surrender your critical faculties. It's just that you realize that the story you've been told about material reality, cause and consequence, space and time, it's less than the full story. And because it's less than the full story, with all due discernment, with all due care, with all due critical caution, be open to the possibility that the world is radically different from the one you imagined. So when I have something like a serendipity or a feeling that the universe is somehow talking to me, I can explain it away, but I prefer not to, and I don't have to. The universe may well be enchanted, and there may well be a form of relationship between the cosmos and us that we need to reconnect with, and at scale and quickly, so that the major collective action problems we face feel different, and they feel different not just to the niche people who are complaining, but to the powers that be as well. You can't really know. So in the absence of not being able to know with certainty, do you opt for a kind of conventional view of how things are that is still culturally hegemonic? Or do you venture out into other ways of knowing that seem less socially validated, but perhaps more emotionally rewarding and credible? And personally, I do the latter. But I do think it's delicate, because you could have psychosis, the mental structure could just collapse, and I have schizophrenia in my family. I don't want to wish away the mental structures lightly, right? I'm very happy for sanity and reason. It's just that I also feel that the world is much more than we've been led to believe. I believe consciousness is an ontological primary, a fundamental feature of reality. I think value and meaning are inherent to the fabric of reality, not just socially constructed. I'm at ease with using the word God, though I don't quite know what I mean by that. But I do feel there's a kind of relationship between the whole and the parts that's constantly happening. And sometimes you can feel yourself in the whole in a way that's quite personal and enlivening. I would just hope that when we try and think about the future, people in the social change world, they often don't go there. they stick within the narrow confines of what's politically possible and culturally acceptable. But I think a lot of people in our network feel instinctively that's not enough, that you have to actually widen the scope of the inquiry, because only then do you get the quality of idea and the kind of institutional and cultural innovation that might be more worthy of the scale of the challenges we face. There's that old line by Charles Kettering that a problem well stated is half solved, which I always thought was only about half true. I don't think it's the whole truth. You need to do more than specify the problem. And we're a bit beyond problems. We're in a kind of predicament now. But still, all very well, but what do we do, right? So one thing I've suggested is that trying to get beyond a crisis mentality seems to me to be quite important. This has come to me quite recently, but I've noticed that the people that I admire are not fixated with crisis. People I'm drawn to these days are not those who are pointing out just how dangerous it all is. They're people who are already underway doing something different. People who are actually innovating in a way that prefigures the next world are the ones that I admire the most. And very few of them are motivated by the language of crisis. And I find this very intriguing because at a purely conceptual level, some would argue that the entire thrust of modernity, the entire sort of engine that drives the progress narrative and the future orientation is the perpetual construction and solving of crises. And this is through war, this is through sort of capital investment. It happens in institution building. It's like, this is a big crisis, let's solve it by doing this. And that's how the whole thing keeps moving over many, many centuries. But where we are now is, we can't keep on talking of crisis and solving them. That's actually, rather than being the solution, you begin to see that's part of the problem, that entire way of framing things. Instead, you've got to look for potential. Right? You've got to look, where is the scope to do things fundamentally differently in a transformative way, and I mean that in a specific way, not just as a kind of rhetorical flourish, but transformative in the sense that the underlying form of it, the underlying reality of it, you go beyond in some way. Going from the nation state to the bioregion is an example of that. Getting out of a university department speaking about sustainability and actually having your own farm where you actually model how to grow crops is an example of that. Creating a pop-up school rather than getting a job in a university department is part of that. Creating new language, so let's say Nora Bateson's Afani poiesis, for example, which is a kind of tending to what is latent, seeing what's unseen and moving with that in some way, is another example. These are the things to get behind, and at a more spiritual level is to do with calling, right? I don't know how else to put this other than to say that there's a place where Carl Jung's idea of individuation meets Elinor Ostrom's idea of the functional commons, the solving of collective action problems or collective action solutions. There's a place where individuation meets collective action solutions. And you can think of it as a kind of collective individuation. And what I mean by that is the distinction between the I and the we begins to break down. And not in a coercive, there's no individual anymore, but rather the very notion of what an individual is that they're part of a collective and responding to its needs. And the very notion of what a collective is something that gives rise to individuated beings. That's what we want to get to. But to get there, I do believe you have to tune in to something more cosmic, which is something like your own sense of what you're meant to be doing. Now, not everyone is, let's say, spiritually musical. Not everyone hears that frequency. But for a lot of people, I think they do sense it, and they may even be in denial about it, but they feel there's something they're meant to be doing. And I guess I feel the more that we tune into that, and of course listen for feedback from the world, otherwise you get caught in narcissistic spirals of self-indulgence, but look at what the world appears to need, think of what you have to offer it, And that's where we're speaking of something like collective individuation. And it's also about potential. It's not just about solving a problem to prop up the status quo. It's like, what is actually transforming the world, changing the underlying form, going beyond it, creatively, subversively, transgressively even. That's the kind of work that excites me. Hope lies not so much in the massive armies and the big plans, but in the people tending to everyday life. Now it's quite an uncomfortable, I find it quite a difficult thought to bear, because there's a part of me that is more conventionally masculine in the sense of like try and disclose the problem and fix it. But I'm growing out of that. I sort of feel that's actually not the right way to approach things. Great to map things if you can and see as clearly as you can, but the hope lies from something more like digging where you stand, tending to what's yours to deal with. Now, that doesn't mean shutting off the rest of the world, but it does mean asking deeply, given that context, what is my work in this context? And that gets back to the cosmolocal idea. So it's something like this. It's not a big grand action plan. It's trusting in the innovation of smaller groups. For those who are more theoretically inclined, in the world of hyper objects, and by hyper objects we mean these almost unintelligible ideas like the climate crisis and the pandemic and the metacrisis, these things we can't quite get our head around, but we still live every day. In the world of hyper objects, you need hypo subjects. And by hypo subjects, it's not hyper agents. You don't need more Elon Musks. You need more people who are turning away from the miasma and the drama of the global election problem, global situation, towards the spiritual calling of the work they're meant to do in the context they have, but not in a politically naive way, in a way that is deeply informed by the need to generate a new reality.